Listeners, we are back today with Ian Riutta, who we spoke with last week's episode on ethical non-monogamy. And it was so great, so in depth that we had to come back for more. Ian, we won't let you go. So we got to talk more with you because we really have to get into I want to start out with some of the misconceptions that folks have about E&M, ethical non-monogamy. So you'll hear us say E&M a lot for folks who might have missed the last episode. Let's just start there. What are some of the misconceptions that people have about polyamorous relationships, about E&M, and all the different types of relationships that kind of fall under that umbrella term?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that comes to a lot of people's minds is the non-monogamy part, right? So
Yeah,
they gloss over the ethical part and they just think it's all about sex and having fun and adult stuff, right? And like
right.
that's part of it, just like it's part of any adult relationship, but it's not the main focus. And so I think that is the first people when you tell them you're poly or ethically non-monogamous, they're like, "Oh, I'm too jealous. I could never do that, or I could never be with multiple people sexually in the same time span or whatever." And a lot of people also think it means like group things because there's a lot of what are called kind of unicorn hunters. Like and usually that's a couple, often a man and a woman that are looking for a third person to join them and date both of them. And often they're looking for a bisexual woman. And those are called unicorn hunters. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that there can be some kind of unhealthy dynamics there if people aren't cautious about doing it.
Hmm.
And so I think those are some of the biggest misconceptions is that it's all about
Yeah,
sex and that you're just looking for a third for your couple to spice things up. And really, that's not what it's about. Like, those things can certainly happen if they evolve that way. But if you go into it looking for those things specifically, I think it's probably not going to be the healthiest and the best
yeah.
course of action.
Yeah, yeah. And there's the assumption there too. I think that's what we're really looking at is the assumption that's what the relationship entails, or that it's just limited to that,
Hmm.
where that's not necessarily true for everyone and might even be for a sliver of the population, for the E&M population. And
Right.
also, it's also not just limiting what E&M looks like from the outside physically, but also emotionally. We talked a
Hmm.
little bit in last week's episode about the deep emotional connection that you can have with multiple partners, just like you can with friends. And I loved that you
Hmm.
used that example or that kind of analogy there. And one of the things that gets overlooked in the stereotypes is that that really you can have different parts of yourself being activated and being accessed, we should say, and even explored um, because of the multiple partners that are involved.
Hmm.
Whereas people tend to go, like you're saying, straight to the sex, straight to the physical part.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as you say, like there is so much more to it. You can have a partner that loves live music and you can have a partner that really doesn't like live music. And
Yeah.
if you only get to pick one partner, like you might have to forego that part of yourself that loves live music indefinitely or for the rest of your life. Or you might only be able to do that with friends if you found that. But it's nice having multiple partners that are into different things. If everybody was into the same thing, it would be cool, but it would also get kind of boring at some point. So it's cool to have diversity and have the freedom to be able to like embrace all of yourself and like the things that you like. When you find those things that you align with on a particular partner, like it's really awesome because like I said, you might not be able to share that with a different partner. So you really get to engage multiple facets of yourself. Whereas I feel like in more traditional love styles like monogamy, you might not get to, or those parts might have to be dormant for a little while.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it works out well. I think I like the freedom and I like being able to explore multiple parts of myself and yeah, figure out what I like and where it aligns.
And the thing that I'm hearing too is that people actually have the opportunity to experience increased belonging. Belonging is central to this podcast.
Hmm.
And I'm curious from you, how do you think belonging plays a role in ethical non monogamy?
Well, I think going back to kind of what I was just touching on, it's nice because you get to present all of yourself, right, to somebody. And like all of those parts of you may not mesh well with a particular partner, but you may have another partner that those parts do get to mesh with. And so for me, a personal sense of belonging, like I get to exercise all of myself or more parts of myself and kind of own it and not feel like anything has to be suppressed or anything like that. And like, just, I feel like a larger sense of community is also where I take a lot of belonging and those feelings of being wanted for me as a whole and the things that, that I can offer. Um, and like having multiple partners, there's more chances for people to kind of help you feel wanted because all of us are wanted by many people and liked by many people. And we don't often hear how awesome we are, which is something I
Yeah.
try to like tell my friends and tell my partners and anybody that'll listen. I try to tell them how awesome they are because I feel like a lot of people don't hear that very often, or they might hear it from a romantic partner or something, or maybe from their friends. But yeah, I think when you have multiple people telling you that you are wanted in various ways, especially in a ethically non-monogamous sense, like it does help you feel more wanted. It does give at least me a good sense of belonging.
Yeah.
Going back to like the military brat thing growing up, like moving around so much, like we were always kind of the outsiders and the new people. And so like I never really had that sense of I belonged in this particular spot. So as an adult, like that's really important to me to feel like I am wanted and I belong and like I have a group of people that like want to include me.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers the question, but
It does. It does. And as you're talking, I can imagine that some people would think like, oh, you're just using this, Ian, because you have some deep-rooted insecurity around your upbringing and all that. And what's interesting is that I have noticed so oftentimes, particularly in Western society, how we pathologize needs.
hmm,
We pathologize it and we villainize people or make them out to be weak in some way or not enough in some way because we need one another. And that's central to the work that I do is kind of breaking down um, those pathologies that we project onto folks because we actually do need folks to mirror back to us and to see us, to embrace us, to celebrate us, the three core components that I think make up belonging. I don't think it's just one thing. And I notice in this very individualistic society, especially that we're in, that it's like, oh, you should be able to meet all your needs yourself on the one hand. And on the other hand, we also kind of villainize, especially women who are single or who don't want to have children, right? It's just the women, especially, or especially women, or men are kind of glamorized, like, oh, they're living the bachelor life or whatever. But yeah, it's interesting because I to see people doing that, and I say interesting, but what I really mean is that it's isolating. Yeah, but when I hear you say it's great to be wanted by other folks, and it's wonderful to hear other people um, see who I am and reflect that back to me. I find it really refreshing, particularly for a white identifying man to say that, to be open about like, hey, I have needs and that's okay. And that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with me. It means that I'm acknowledging my own humanity. And
yeah,
that's so refreshing, I have to tell you.
thank you. Yeah. And
Yeah.
going to like what you said earlier about meeting your needs, like we are humans and like we all have needs and wants and desires and like we are social creatures. Even those of us who are introverts, like we need people on some level at some point. Like we can't just be alone all the time.
Yeah.
And having those needs met, whether they be emotional or social or physical or whatever, it makes such a huge difference. And I do kind of feel like no one person can meet any other person's needs fully. Like it's if you're buying a house, like you might have a checklist of 50 things that you really want, and you have like 10 must haves and like a bunch of nice to haves. And like if anybody's ever bought a house, like you know that like you're never going to find the perfect house. Like there's always going to
Right.
be trade-offs. Like it's got these 8 things, but it doesn't have these 2 things, but this other house has those 2 things. But like so
Yeah.
there's always trade-offs, and I just don't think it's realistic that any one person can meet all of your needs. And that's not to say I'm trashing monogamy, because monogamy can be absolutely wonderful as well. It's just I find the freedom of being ethically non-monogamous or polyamorous really nice because it gives me a better shot at meeting those needs, and it takes away a lot of pressure from a particular partner to have to try and meet those needs,
Yeah.
especially if they're not necessarily aligned. Like just going back to the concert example, if I really want to go out and see live music and my partner really isn't into that, like it would be kind of stressful for them to feel like they have to meet that need of mine or they're letting me down. When
Right.
it can be nice to be like, oh, you have other partners that can help you meet those needs. Therefore, I can present myself authentically and give you what I can offer you and where we can align without feeling guilty about not being able to meet all of those needs that you might have.
There's negotiation that happens in every relationship. And what I'm hearing from you is that there's certain negotiations that you don't have to make necessarily in some of your relationships because you have other partners. And hey, that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
That sounds
Yeah.
amazing, honestly. But again, I think there's this just misconception, and the whole point of having this conversation openly with other people to be able to hear is to help break some of that down. And so when you touched on monogamy, and I'm curious from you, there's so much societal emphasis on monogamy. I'm wondering how you think that might impact someone's ability to experience like really authentic belonging, not just with other people, but even within themselves. And it
hmm
might sound like we're a broken record, but I'm curious to hear it broken down, even if it sounds all the same to you.
Um, well, there's a really interesting book called Sex at Dawn that can be a little controversial, but it sort of looks at I forget the word, anthropomorphic, whatever, the study of human.
Anthropological.
That's the one. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
It studies kind of that, and it looks at our two closest ancestors, one being chimpanzees and one being bonobos, and the difference between the two of them.
Mhm.
And that book says a lot of really interesting things, and I would recommend it to monogamous people or people that are interested in E&M or anybody. It's interesting to think about. Um, but that talks about where they think monogamy came from. And in more tribal societies where they're more nomadic and they're more on the move, like monogamy isn't really a thing. And this is still true in some of those societies today that are still pretty nomadic. Like they share all of their stuff because if they don't, they die. And sometimes that includes sharing partners. And like the children of the tribe are children of the whole tribe. They're not any one particular person's child, not any one particular person's mate. Like they kind of share stuff. And this book posits that, and I don't want to get too deep or off topic, but it posits
Yeah.
that monogamy was sort of a creation based on property and the need to know that like I have accrued this stuff and it's mine. And when I die, it passes to my descendants and not anybody else. So in a sense, it sort of came from this like desire to keep what's mine and not have to share it. Um,
Mm.
and again, I'm not bashing monogamy. I'm just saying what this book
Sure.
theorized. And that to me was really interesting because I think about in a monogamous setting, there is this sense of like, you're mine or I'm yours, which to me has kind of a sense of ownership. When if I want to do something, I need to get my partner's permission. And I think for me, and again, I'm not saying any of that is bad or wrong. It's just a different way of doing things. And in one of the mental shifts I had when I switched over to polyamory or ethical non-monogamy was really getting rid of this sense of like ownership of another person, and not in a prisoner way, just in like they choose to be with me and I choose to be with them because we choose to be, not because we have to be or because we've entered into this thing that they are now beholden to. And it's like they can offer me what they feel they can offer me. And I don't really have any right to expect certain things from them. Like,
Right.
even though we might be married, like I don't have a right to expect hugs or kisses or sex or any of those things. Like, hopefully they want to share those things with me, but it's up to them what they choose to give me. And I don't own any of those things. Right. And
Yeah.
and it's also a big mental shift with ethical non-monogamy is when you're first starting out, there's something that I feel like is kind of toxic. It's called like veto powers, where if there's an established couple that opens up or becomes ethically non-monogamous, that if there's potentially a new partner entering the mix or one of them is dating somebody new, it's kind of called couples privilege. So like if I was like, hey, I have a new partner and we want to go on a date, couples privilege would mean that I have to check with my existing partner to make sure that they're okay with that. Right. So I kind of need
Oh,
their permission. And that's where the veto power comes in because the existing partner could be like, no, you and I haven't gone on a date in a week. You don't get to go on a date with somebody else. And they can veto that. And that can be really toxic and really, it's not great because you shouldn't be able to have a say in what somebody else chooses to do with a partner of theirs. Like you can set boundaries for yourself. That's perfectly healthy and perfectly fine. But, like telling somebody else what they're allowed to do, unless you're like a parent to them, which is a different story. But, like generally speaking is, in my opinion, not a great thing.
It removes
Exactly.
agency. And then the person
Right.
can't self-celebrate in
Yes.
terms of like they lose their own voice and decision-making power. And it actually sounds really controlling. And maybe I'm ignorant, okay? But the way that you're describing it, it sounds very controlling. And it kind of goes back to that. It ironically, right? It kind of goes back to that ownership. So for me, I'm thinking like, okay, so are we ethically non-monogamous or are we not? Right? I mean,
Right.
in that kind of situation. But as you're describing kind of that that nomadic kind of lifestyle, I wouldn't say lifestyle, that nomadic way of living that people had at one point and in some places still have, how monogamy really wasn't a thing. It makes me think of growing up in a small town, actually, in a really tiny town. And everybody's dating the same people. These two break up and then these two get together and then everyone's mad. And then there's like fights and then people throwing hands, like we say in the South and in the country. Like it would get really antagonistic. And it's like, but who do you expect me to date? The pickings are slim as it is. And then somebody who's actually going to connect with me in some way. But that was always really a thing. I don't know. Maybe we should just make it a rule that if you're in a town that's below so-and-so, a population less than so-and-so, we were in monogamy altogether. But yeah, and also when you're talking about ownership, it also makes me think of, and look, this might be controversial. And again, it's kind of like what you're saying. It's not that you're bashing monogamy. I'm not bashing people getting married and taking the other partner's last name. But when we look at the history of it, it's around ownership. It's like, particularly, especially in, we'll say, straight couples, where the woman is expected to take the man's last name. And that was a way for it to be known that she was his property.
Right.
And so it's, again, not bashing it, but it's that ownership. And that's what it's making me think of. They kind of go together in some way.
Yeah. And like we have a lot of systems in place that we've had for thousands of years in various cultures. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad, but I think it's a good thing to try to consider where these things came from and challenge them. If it doesn't still work for us, if it doesn't serve us, why are we still doing this? And that was something that I came to when I first learned about polyamory. And there was a while where I felt like I would be equally happy getting into a monogamous relationship or a polyamorous relationship. When I feel like my views have kind of shifted where I could be in a monogamous relationship, but I don't really see the point or the need. Like to me, it just feels like I can be just as committed to someone. I can marry them. I can live my entire life, have children with them, whatever. Like I can do all the things that you can do in a monogamous relationship and still have the freedom to explore connections with other people. Like it doesn't lessen that with the person that I have. And that's kind of another misconception is when people hear poly or ethically non-monogamous, they're like, oh, I couldn't do that. I'm committed to my partner. And that's honestly kind of offensive because like I am very committed to my partners just as much as anybody monogamous would be. Like, and to me, commitment might mean something a little different. But it means to me the important things. Like I'll be there if you need me. Like I love you. I want to be with you. Like I'm dedicating my time and my energy, my life, and all of these things. Like, but it might not necessarily be the only person. When an analogy I like to say is that like I want somebody to grow old with. We can be in our rocking chairs on the front porch, but I want a big porch, so there's room for more chairs up there. And that's kind of how I see ethical non-monogamy. It's like you don't have to limit yourself, and it doesn't take away.
I love what you're saying about commitment. The name of this podcast is Belonging Reimagined. It's like we're expanding our understanding of what belonging is, and the way you describe commitment is the same thing. Maybe you should start a podcast called Commitment Reimagined. I mean, it just sounds like maybe we could stop and pause for a second and just ask questions, become curious about what's the root of some of these things that we've come to understand? And I think sometimes we don't know what we don't know. So we don't even know to ask about it. And my hope is that this helps folks press the pause button and say, I never thought about it like that before. I didn't consider that before.
And something, I would encourage anybody that's listening to this, whether you're in a relationship or any style, is just to if you are in a relationship or past relationships, look at it and figure out if there are any parts of yourself that you felt like you couldn't do or you had to repress. My husband doesn't like Brussels sprouts, therefore I can never cook Brussels sprouts. And that's a dumb example, but maybe just look inward and see if there are any aspects of yourself that you felt like you've had to repress. Maybe you have different drives for sexy stuff, or you like different foods or whatever. And if you have had those parts of yourself that you felt like you've had to repress, imagine what it might be like to, imagine if your partner liked those things, or if you were able to explore those things. And I'm not saying you should go out and become ethically non-monogamous, but as a thought experiment, maybe examine those things and think about what it might feel like if you could re-engage those parts of yourself, those things that you like. How would that feel? I have found that it feels great. I've learned all kinds of stuff about myself that I hadn't either didn't know. New partners can bring stuff that you didn't know you liked. You don't know what you don't know.
Right.
But they can also reawaken parts of yourself that you've maybe gone without for a while. So anyway, I would recommend, just for self-reflection for anybody, are there parts of yourself you felt like have been dormant for a while, and how would it feel to bring those back?
Yeah. Yeah. Like making new friends, like you said before. So I'm curious now about family dynamics, right?
Yeah.
People are asking all kinds of questions, right? Since the last episode, they're like, what kind of family dynamics do they have here? What do you tell the kids? How do you co-parent? What does that look like? Tell us all the things. We have questions.
So the first thing I'll say is that I have found that kids listen to what you say if you present it as this is how it is.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is my kids didn't have all these misconceptions, or they understood, they in social media or whatever, they've seen that monogamy is the norm. They know that, usually one person marries one other person and they get married and have babies and whatever else. But when I became ethically non-monogamous, I just sat them both down and I talked to them very openly and was like, this is how I am, and I just want you guys to understand it. And you can love as many people as you want to, as long as you're doing it in authentic, kind, and ethical ways. And you can love anybody that you want to. It doesn't have to be a man or woman. It could be anybody that you feel a connection with. And as long as you're doing it in kind, authentic ways. And I just kind of explained it to them like that. And they were like, so you could have 2 girlfriends? And I was like, yep. And they're like, and your partner that we know of can have another boyfriend? I'm like, yep. And they're like, and that's not a problem, right? I'm like, no, it's not a problem at all. And they were like, okay. And then they went about their business. There wasn't this huge, kind of revulsion that we get as adults who've been kind of conditioned for decades that this is a thing outside the norm. Kids take things as they are. If you're like, hey, don't touch the stove, it's hot. Hopefully they will listen to you and they go, okay, I won't touch the stove.
Right.
Sometimes they need to touch it on them for themselves to learn the hard way, but mostly kids accept it. And I think a lot of it comes down to how you present it as well. If you're trying to talk to your kids about it and you're like, there's this thing I'm doing and it's kind of weird, and I know a lot of people don't like it, and it's like this, then they're going to feel icky about it. But if you're just like, hey, this is how it is, and this is how I do stuff, and you can do this if you want to. But I also make it very clear to my kids that they don't have to do it the way I do, and they can love anybody or not love anybody. That's fully an option too. There are people that don't want to ever love anybody or don't ever want to be physically intimate with people. And that's totally cool too. It's up to each person to live their life how they want to live it. And if they want to make connections, I want my kids to have all the opportunities they can. And I didn't realize that being ethically non-monogamous was an actual option until sort of the end of my marriage. And so now that I know it's an option, it feels like a natural fit for me. And I feel like a lot of people don't even know it's an option. And that's the part I want my kids to know is
Yeah.
I'm happy with whatever they choose. I just want them to make an informed choice so they know what their options are before they commit to something.
Yeah. And sometimes it might not even be a choice. It might be a part of someone's identity. And I think
Yeah.
that's something to note too, is that, and I might have mentioned this before. I don't know what's on camera and what's on not, folks. Ian and I have chatted a few times, but I might have mentioned this before that for some folks, it's a way of living it's a relationship dynamic, right? For other folks, it's a part of someone's identity. I mean, I have a friend who's in a monogamous relationship with someone because that person kind of says that this is how I am. I'm a monogamous person. And so my friend is like, I love you enough that this is what I'm not. Well, let me start over. My friend is like, I want to be in your life. I want you to be in my life. I'm willing to have a monogamous relationship structure. I myself, as far as how I identify, is still as polyamorous. But the relationship structure that I'm in with you is monogamous. These are kind of the rules of engagement, so to speak, in terms of the type of relationship that we're in. And what I love about what you're saying, Ian, as far as parenting, is that you're opening that up for your children as a possibility of something that is potentially part of their identity. And they can now consider that as part of their identity as they go through this identity exploration that's very typical psychosocially in all parts of life, but especially in those teenage years and those middle school years and young adult years. It's really paramount and just pressing, I should say, that we're trying to figure out, like, who am I? And now that gets to be something that's on the table, like as they're looking at as dating potentially or whatever. And it's the same thing that many of us have done with our kids. I did this with my kids in preschool when it came to not just different gender identities, but also different sexualities. So letting it be known way up front when they became aware of people being partnered with other people, that there are no gender structures that we go by in terms of what that looks like. So that it was important for me to share that with them so that as they are exploring their sexuality in the future, they would, in their minds, it's like they've always known that's a possibility, that they're gay or that they're queer identifying, for example, or potentially trans or gender expansive. And I wanted that to be something that was the norm for them, regardless of what society was teaching them. So that's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I don't want to get too far off topic, but like there's a lot of things that I didn't even know were options as a kid and growing up. And now that we know that there are many different gender identities, or when some people are still really resistant to that, they hold on to what they know, which is fine if they want to do that. But I want my kids to know that they have options so that they can find what feels most authentic to them and not feel like they have to live this way. Like,
Right.
a lot of people live closeted their whole lives because like they get shamed or they don't even understand that they can be out in whatever out means to them in whatever form. But I want my kids to have all the choices they can so that they can decide what's authentic to them. And going back to like, I think of college, right? And when you're college or high school is when you're sort of finding a lot of your identity as an adult and who you're going to be. And when you look at it, like a lot of people in high school or college, they are non-monogamous. And honestly, a lot of people are non-monogamous until they find one person they want to settle down with. And then they cut everybody else off and pick that one person. And there are serial daters or serial monogamists who literally only go on a date with one person and see that all the way through before considering going on a date with another person. But a lot of people don't. Like a lot of people, especially in college and high school, like they date multiple people, sometimes at the same time. They might have 2 or 3 dates in a week with different people trying to narrow down who they want. So a lot of monogamous people are already being non-monogamous. They're just not necessarily doing it ethically. And to me, that means that like I would tell another partner. So like if I was intimate with somebody, like, and I was dating somebody else, like I would let that other person know, like, hey, I am dating other people. I am intimate with them so that they can make an informed decision. But thinking back to college and high school, like a lot of people are just, they might be dating this person, maybe being intimate, dating that person, maybe being intimate, but they don't often tell those other people what they're doing. And that's okay. But I find that goes into the ethical part of ethical non-monogamy is I want somebody that would choose to be with me or choose to even go on a date with me to know what they're getting into. And that's the informed, enthusiastic consent that I feel like is so important to
Yeah.
everything, not just ethical non-monogamy.
And most
Um,
people don't think of that as unethical. They think of that as dating.
right.
It is
And
dating. They were taking out the
yeah,
commitment part sometimes too.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know that in the first couple of years I was ethically non-monogamous. I have always thrown lots of parties and stuff, but I had one or two people that would come to my parties and they were pretty judgy against me because they're like, "Oh, you're the poly people. You date, you're having sex with lots of people and like blah 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 blah." And they were very judgy. But at the same time, like I know that these people had been on like 3 or 4 dates with 3 or 4 different women in one
Right.
week, and pretty sure they were intimate with most of them. And it felt kind of like the pot or calling the kettle black. It's
Right.
like we're basically doing the same thing, except I'm telling the people I'm with that I'm with other people, and you're
Right.
not. So how do you get to judge me?
Yeah.
And that was something that never sat well with me. And
Yeah.
so anyway, and I know it. That was one particular example, and a lot of people do monogamy and traditional relationship styles in perfectly wonderful, healthy, loving ways. But
Yeah.
I think one important message with the misconception thing is just that, like, to me, the ethical is the most important part of the non-monogamy. Like, that's why it's
Yeah.
at the beginning. It's ethical non-monogamy. Like,
Yeah.
there's a whole set of personal guidelines and ethics that I do so that, yeah, my partners or potential partners know what they're signing up for.
There are different ways to do relationships, folks. I mean, it's just like,
Yeah.
and looking at it from like this, oh, this is the one, like the highest standard. Looking at this norm as being the highest standard is really exclusive. It's not including other perspectives. It's not including an understanding that your way is not the only way and that your way is not the best way, that there doesn't have to be a best and a worst. There doesn't
Yeah.
have to be a standard at all. In fact,
Yeah.
it can just be, instead of more hierarchical, like, oh, this at the top is the best, like this monogamous kind of committed and monogamous one person relationship. It's like, why don't we look at it as more like circular? Like there's circle and this circle and they're overlapping things. Like committed can be an overlap between the different relationships. Loving can be an overlap if you're thinking of like a Venn diagram. We can look at things in more holistic ways instead of this like top down or bottom up kind of way of like, this is the best. And so that means that everything else must be worse in some
Yeah.
way. Yeah.
A-
It's really
And
limiting.
it is. And honestly, it's not a competition when
No.
I have a very much like live and let live style of
Yeah.
how I live my life. And like what another couple or relationship chooses to do has no effect on me unless they're directly interacting with me. But like,
Yeah.
I don't know what my neighbors do at all. And I'm fine with that. Like, I'm hoping they're living
Yeah.
wonderful, happy lives. And
Right.
I think as a society, we can get so hell bent on like, we have to know what everybody's doing and tell them what they're allowed to do and normalize everything. And like, you don't really like if they don't have a direct effect on your life, let them do what they want to do and be happy. That's my
Yeah.
philosophy. So
I lived in a neighborhood, when you're talking about neighbors, I lived in a neighborhood that was known as the swingers neighborhood. And it was, we didn't know that. We didn't care when we found out. We were like, oh, cool. It's not so cookie cutter like we thought it was. So like,
yeah,
we thought, oh, that's great. And it was interesting, like some of the assumptions, because there was this neighborhood like hangout, right? It was like they had karaoke. It was a bar and grill kind of place, but on Saturday nights they did karaoke. And my partner and I were monogamous, but we're friendly with folks generally. We're therapists. Well, therapists can be, we can go one of either way, depending on the day, to be honest with you. Sometimes we're not wanting to talk to anybody. That's just the truth, y'all.
you're friendly.
But yeah, we like our clients. I'm just saying, when we're there, I love seeing y'all. But sometimes in life, we're friendly, sometimes not. But generally, when we went out, we were in a friendly mood with folks. And so we would chat with folks or whatever. Well, a couple of years after going to karaoke night, the karaoke, I guess, disc jockey, I don't know what the title is, was like, I thought y'all were swingers. And we're like, why? He said, because you're friendly. And we're like, because we're friendly. It was just, it's interesting, like some of the assumptions around what that means and what that looks like also.
Yeah. And it's interesting you bring swingers up, because that's another area I feel like is often lumped in with poly, people hear that
Hmm.
you're polyamorous, ethically non-monogamous. They're like, oh, you're a swinger. And it's
Right.
like, no. And I've known swingers, and like, I know there can be some overlap. The Venn diagrams can overlap in a lot of cases, but they are different things. And I have found that most of the swingers I know are monogamous couples
Hmm.
who want to add a little bit of extra fun physical spice to their life.
Yeah.
And from my experience, the swingers tend to not so much worry about the physical stuff. Like, they're like, hey, partner or wife, whatever, like, you can have fun with this other person physically, like, that's cool. But if you start developing an emotional connection with them, that's where we have to cut it off, because that seems threatening
Right.
to certain swingers. Whereas I feel like poly and E&M is sort of it's not the opposite, but like, I don't feel like we're necessarily afraid of the emotional connection. Like,
Mm.
that's kind of where I would prefer first. Like, don't get me wrong, I love the physical, intimate stuff. Like, it's great, but like the connection is really what I'm after.
Right.
Whereas I
Right.
feel like a lot of swingers, they're not. They're like, the physical's fine, but if there's a connection, that's not cool. We have to cut it off and try something different. And
So swinging could
yeah,
be a type of E&M, but
it
it's not
can.
the same
Yeah,
thing as polyamory, we would say.
correct.
It's
Definitely
different.
different things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah.
there are going to be folks then who are listening to this podcast who are like, oh shit, I'm in a monogamous relationship. Maybe I have been for a while. And I think I might be a person who potentially has an identity as that I haven't even explored, or I just want to explore this. Um, I don't know where to start. Like, how do I explain this to my partner?
Hmm.
Even for folks who maybe are not in a relationship or single, what resources do they have? I read a book years ago from my first E&M client called The Ethical Slut, which, by the way, fantastic title. Ian doing two thumbs up for those of you who are listening. If you're on
Hmm.
YouTube, you can see us. Super fun book, I think, as you described before, really fun. And I just love that title, The Ethical Slut. Um, but there's some resources out there, right? So there's some podcasts and other things, which we can mention in a minute. But what do we do? What does someone do if they're thinking, oh, I want to explore this. I don't know how to have this conversation with my
I mean,
partner.
I feel like in general, like, what works for me is to do your research, like, look it up. Like, I think books are a fantastic way to explore that and learn about it, because you don't want to make an uninformed choice.
Mhm.
And I know that, like, when I learned about polyamory and ethical non-monogamy, like, it was important to me to make that informed choice. So I went out and I got The Ethical Slut, which was fantastic. When I got More Than Two, which is another book that can be a little controversial, but I feel like those two really laid out ethical non-monogamous structures, and they talked about a lot of common words that are used and like healthy and unhealthy ways to do things, and really got my mind thinking about, is this something that could be a good fit for me? So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I would recommend, if anybody's at all curious, like, definitely The Ethical Slut. Like, I feel like both books are a little bit similar. Like, I feel like most poly people will tell you like one or the other or both of them. The Ethical Slut, I feel like, is kind of like your awesome aunt that is kind of naughty and kind of fun and sneaks you into movies and stuff. Like,
Yeah.
that's sort of like her telling you all the cool stuff you can do and have fun with.
Right.
And so I think that's a little bit easier to digest. Whereas More Than Two is a little bit more, it's not, but it's a little bit more like a textbook, where it's like,
Mhm.
it very clearly lays out the definitions and the different structures and how to do stuff. And I think both of them are very useful.
Okay.
So I would probably start with those. There's another one. I mentioned Sex at Dawn earlier, which is interesting. And a lot of people mention Polysecure, which I haven't personally read, but that I think deals with like different attachment styles. And
Yeah.
some people really love that one. Like I said, I can't speak to it. I haven't read it.
Yeah.
Um, but those are ways that I would, if I were somebody who was curious about this, borrow it from the library. We have these free public libraries.
That's
Get a
true.
library card if you don't have one. Borrow it from the library. And
Yeah.
if you have to keep it in your nightstand, or you feel like you have to hide it from people, like, that's a bummer that you feel that way. But I feel like it's better to be informed and learn about those things and then make a choice based on how it feels to you. Because some people are very monogamous by that is their nature. And like, they'll read all these books and they'll be like, yep, still not for me. And that's great. Like, do what works for you.
Right. Before kind of diving in and then being like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. Like, you need to kind of be informed to make sure that you've thought things through, especially as we talk about, you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
Looking into resources could help.
Yeah. And the thing is, if you're looking at like opening a relationship or becoming ethically non-monogamous or something you haven't done before, like, you have the potential to actually hurt people, including yourself, not just a current partner or a family, but like, you have a potential to hurt other people. If you start dating somebody and they fall in love and then you're like, oh, actually this doesn't work, like, that's going to be really hard for them. And I think it's important to do your research, but also like there's kind of some poly people like it and some poly people hate it, but there's this kind of this adage or whatever that says that like your first ethically non-monogamous relationship is like a sacrifice to the poly gods, which means it's never going to work out. And that's not always true. And again, some people love that, some people hate it. But I do feel like it comes from a sense of like, the first time you're trying something, you're not going to be good at it. You're not going to know what to do. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to have to learn to deal with jealousy and lots of other things that are going to come up.
Yeah.
When I feel like rather than just diving into it, read some books, do some research before you do that. It will help show you some of the pitfalls before you fall into them, when it will give you some tools to help you cope with some of these things before you're confronted with them.
Yeah. A lot of people know that I've had multiple surgeries. I've had 9 surgeries on my hip area. And look, it might sound different, but I'm talking about in terms of preparing the brain. Each time there's a long conversation with my doctor, there's a long conversation with the team. We're going to talk about what to expect, how to prepare beforehand, what to expect afterwards, the discomfort that's going to come up. And this is actually what it makes me think of, like preparation for, look, humans don't like to be uncomfortable. We just don't like it, especially in Western society. We really don't like it. And we have this entitlement around our comfort oftentimes. And so preparing for the discomfort so that we can sit in it and not react to it in these kind of precautionary ways, like, oh, I can't do that. That's uncomfortable. But like knowing this is what to expect. Okay, it's gonna feel this certain kind of way, or this is just that. Being able to name things is really important. So, Ian, what does belonging mean to you?
I think belonging is just being wanted, I think is the biggest part. When part of that is wanting yourself and loving yourself. Part of that is being wanted by other people, when in whatever fashion that takes. Like, we're social creatures. Like, those of us who are solo out in the world often don't make it very far or aren't very happy. So I think belonging is just being part of a human culture and being accepted for who you are and accepting other people for who they are. When, that to me, that's what belonging is. And it's super important. So
what you're describing is really beautiful, because it sounds like there's this symbiotic relationship in belonging. It's like belonging is not only that I'm wanted, but also wanting other people. That creates even deeper connection. So thank you so much, Ian. Really appreciate your being here.
Wonderful.
That was a wonderful conversation, and really appreciate and feel honored that you would spend this time with us 2 weeks in a row, helping us break some of this down and also gain more understanding so that we can all be closer to one another, and hopefully bring us closer to one another again, as we probably started out. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mona. It was really fun. And hopefully this gave people some interesting things to think about, and maybe challenge some of their own assumptions. And
absolutely. Can't wait to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. All of the show notes and links can be found on my website at drmonanour.com. That's drmonanour.com. Throughout most episodes, you'll hear me referring to the belonging model that I developed, which is represented by a belonging life map that helps you explore areas in your life where you feel more connection and areas where you might feel more isolation. And you can get a free copy of your own belonging life map on my website. Again, that's drmonanour.com. If you like the Belonging Reimagined podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a review. That can help more folks find us and keep more episodes coming. Until next time, I'm Dr. Mona. you're right where you belong.